Capybara held the floodgate path the way a calm guard held a narrow bridge, not by threatening anyone, but by being exactly where nobody could comfortably pass without noticing. The floodgate sat on the edge of San Isidro Marsh, where the river spilled into a wide wetland before bending toward the coastal farms. It was old infrastructure with a simple purpose: keep saltwater from pushing inland during storms and release fresh water in measured pulses so the rice paddies didn't drown. Concrete walls rose from mud, stained dark from years of wet seasons. A metal gate, ribbed and heavy, could be raised by a handwheel on a platform. The whole place smelled like algae, silt, and warm plants. And there was a path, not a paved walkway, just a narrow strip of packed earth that ran along the gate's service side, used by the maintenance crew and by locals who knew it as the easiest shortcut between the canal and the upper lagoon. When the water was high, that strip became the only dry line across a stretch of marsh. Canoes used it too, not literally on the path, of course, but as a reference point. The floodgate corner was where the current changed, where water pinched and sped up for a few meters before relaxing again into the broader canal. If you were paddling a loaded canoe, you'd aim for the gate, line up with the path, and let the flow carry you cleanly through. Lately, the canoes were drifting slow, not because the current had vanished, not because the paddlers had forgotten how to stroke, because something large and unbothered kept occupying the narrowest part of the route, right where people usually slid past with ease. Matteo Costa noticed it first, and not because he was especially observant, because he was the one who repaired things when the wetland stopped cooperating. He worked for the district water office, which meant he did a little of everything: checked gate levels, replaced worn bolts, cleared debris from culverts, and listened to farmers complain about water like it was personal. Matteo was 38, wiry, and permanently sunburned around the nose. He also had the patient manner of someone who knew arguing with water was pointless. On Tuesday morning, he drove his battered truck to the floodgate with a toolbox and a clipboard. He found the capybara before he even got out. It was sitting on the path like it had scheduled an appointment. A big one, barrel-bodied, wet fur dark and sleek, blunt face lifted slightly as it watched the canal. Its ears flicked at insects. Its eyes looked half-lidded, relaxed. A second capybara lay behind it in the shade of the concrete wall, only a hump of back and a twitching nose visible. Matteo paused with one boot on the truck step and just stared. Capybaras were common along the marsh, but they usually stayed to the reed edges, slipping into water at the slightest disturbance. These ones didn't. They held the service path like it was a warm bench. Matteo stepped down slowly, letting the door close with care instead of a slam. He didn't want to spook them into the canal. A startled capybara could crash into the water and stir up mud, and mud was the enemy of gates and valves. Besides, he wasn't here to chase wildlife. He was here to keep the water system working. He walked toward the handwheel platform, keeping his distance. The capybara watched him, head turning slightly, but it didn't move off the path. It didn't bare teeth. It didn't posture. It simply stayed. Matteo climbed the platform and checked the gauge. Water levels were normal. The gate was set right. No obvious debris at the lower lip. The system should be flowing smoothly. Yet the complaints had been specific. Canoes moving through the pinch point were losing momentum, drifting like they'd hit thick syrup. Matteo looked down at the canal surface. The current did look odd, not weaker, just disrupted. A gentle eddy formed right where the path met water, and the eddy's center was right under the capybara. The animal's body wasn't in the water, but its presence shaped the human behavior around it. Canoe paddlers approaching the gate were slowing early, hesitating, trying to give space, pulling their strokes shorter so they didn't splash near the animal. That changed their entry angle, which changed how they met the pinch current. A small change became a slow drift. As Matteo watched, a canoe appeared up canal. Two men with sacks of fertilizer stacked between their knees. They approached the floodgate corner at a cautious pace. When they saw the capybara on the path, they reduced paddling and let the canoe drift. The canoe slid into the pinch zone slower than it should. The current that usually carried them cleanly through now caught them at a weird angle, nudging the bow toward the concrete wall. One man dipped his paddle quickly to correct, but he did it gently. No splashing, no hard stroke. The canoe scraped the wall with a soft squeal. The capybara didn't flinch. The men did. They muttered, embarrassed and annoyed, and the canoe drifted through, slower than necessary, as if the whole canal had become reluctant. Matteo exhaled. This wasn't a mechanical problem. It was a behavior problem. Humans adjusting around an animal that didn't respect the unspoken move-aside rules people expected. Matteo climbed down from the platform and walked closer, stopping several meters from the capybara. He kept his posture sideways, non-threatening. He spoke softly, more to himself than the animal. "Friend," he murmured, "this is the only dry line." The capybara blinked slowly. Matteo glanced behind it at the second capybara, still lounging. That suggested comfort and safety. The concrete wall blocked wind, the path was dry, and the water was close. Perfect capybara logic. Matteo thought about the maintenance schedule. A crew was coming tomorrow to raise the gate slightly for a planned freshwater release. That meant workers carrying tools and stepping along the path. If the capybaras held the line, the crew would either scare them abruptly or work around them clumsily. Either scenario could turn into someone slipping in mud or dropping equipment. He pulled out his phone and snapped a photo, then texted it to his supervisor with a simple line. Capybaras occupying floodgate service path, not moving easily. Canoe traffic slowing/angled. Need non-harmful solution before release tomorrow. Then he did what he could do alone. He looked for the reason they were choosing that exact spot. He walked slowly along the concrete wall, eyes scanning for anything. Food scraps, fresh vegetation, a mineral lick, something that made the path more attractive than the reed edge. Near the base of the wall, he found it. A narrow strip of fresh grass growing where water seeped from a crack, making the soil just damp enough for tender shoots. The capybara's teeth marks were visible on the grass, clean, flat cuts. A snack bar. Matteo sighed. Of course. He walked back to the capybara and crouched, still at a safe distance. The animal's fur smelled faintly of warm pond water. Its whiskers twitched. It looked content. Matteo didn't want to turn this into a chase. He wanted to redirect. He opened his toolbox and pulled out a bright orange flag marker used for identifying underground lines. He walked 20 meters away along the path toward a wider, safer patch of bank where canoes didn't pinch so tightly. There, he found another small grassy area and pushed the flag into the mud. Then he returned and did the same near the seep grass by the wall, marking it like a do not disturb area, not for the capybara, but for his own crew. He also took a short length of plastic mesh fencing from his truck, leftover from a culvert project, and set it loosely along the edge of the path nearest the seep, not blocking the capybara, just making the snack strip slightly harder to reach from the comfortable lounging spot. It was a small inconvenience. Capybara logic was simple. If food or comfort required more effort, find the easier option. Matteo stepped back and watched. The capybara lifted its head and sniffed the air, sensing change. It didn't bolt. It didn't panic. It simply stood up slowly, stretched like a dog waking from a nap, and waddled a few steps toward the water. Matteo held his breath. If it slipped in now, it might return again and again. But the capybara didn't jump in. It walked down the bank and waded in calmly, water rising up its legs. It paddled across the narrow channel and climbed onto the opposite bank where reeds were thicker and the sun hit a different angle. The second capybara followed, slower, but it followed. Within a minute, the service path was clear. Mateo felt relief, but he didn't trust it. Animals returned to comfortable spots unless the comfort changed permanently. He walked back to the seep grass and examined the crack in the wall. Water seeped steadily, feeding that strip of tender shoots. As long as that seep existed, the snack bar would regrow, and the capybaras would remember the location. Tomorrow's crew could patch the crack with sealant, or lay gravel to reduce growth, or install a low rail that made the path less lounge-friendly without blocking wildlife access to water. Mateo made notes on his clipboard with quick, practical handwriting. As he finished, another canoe approached, this time a woman paddling alone with a basket of produce. She saw the clear path and didn't slow early. She lined up with the pinch current properly and glided through in one smooth, confident drift. No scrape, no awkward hesitation. Mateo watched her pass and nodded to himself. The canoes had drifted slow because the Floodgate path, normally a human shortcut, had become an animal resting spot, and people had adjusted their paddling out of caution. The capybara hadn't done anything dramatic. It hadn't attacked. It had simply held position. And in a narrow water system, sometimes that was all it took to change how everyone moved. Mateo packed his tools and took one last look at the opposite bank. The two capybaras were half hidden in reeds now, chewing calmly, as if nothing had happened. He knew better. Tomorrow, the crew would come. The gate would lift. Fresh water would surge. People would want the path. Canoes would arrive in higher numbers because release days meant better travel and better fishing. If the capybaras returned to the snack strip by the wall, the whole slow drift problem would return with them, quietly, predictably, without anyone being able to blame a broken machine. Mateo climbed into his truck and started the engine, already planning the next day's fix. Not a fight, a redesign. Because the smartest way to move wildlife wasn't to scare it. It was to make the better path the one it chose on its own. By the next morning, the Floodgate felt like it was holding its breath. Mateo arrived before the maintenance crew, not because anyone ordered him to, but because he'd learned that the first 20 minutes of a workday often decided whether the rest of it became calm or chaotic. He brought a small bucket of gravel, a tube of sealant, and 2 extra lengths of plastic mesh. If he waited for supplies approval, the capybaras would have already reclaimed the path. The sun was barely up. Mist hovered low over the marsh like a thin veil. The canal surface was smooth, but you could hear the current pulling under it, a soft whisper against reeds. Mateo parked and walked in. The path was clear. He felt relief, and then immediately mistrust, because clear didn't mean solved. He climbed onto the gate platform and checked the schedule sheet clipped to the rail. The crew was supposed to arrive at 7:30 to lift the gate a quarter turn and hold it for 2 hours, enough to flush the upstream canal and refresh the rice channels. It was routine on paper. In reality, any routine involving water attracted boats, people, and problems. Mateo climbed down and went straight to the seep crack at the base of the concrete wall. The grass there was still tender and bright, fed by that slow leak. The mesh he'd placed yesterday had been nudged slightly aside, just enough to tell him something had pushed at it. Capybara interest. He set down his gravel bucket and knelt. The crack was narrow, but persistent. Water beaded and ran, creating the exact micro-wetness that made the grass irresistible. Mateo squeezed sealant along the seam, pressing it into the gap with a gloved thumb. The smell of adhesive rose sharp against the earthy marsh air. Then he poured gravel over the damp strip and tamped it down with the flat of his boot until the tender grass disappeared under a crunching layer. No grass, no snack bar. It wasn't a beautiful fix, but it was fast, and fast mattered. Next, he set the plastic mesh more deliberately, not as a wall, but as a low-edge reminder that made the path less comfortable for lounging. He pegged it down with metal stakes so it wouldn't flop loose. Anyone could still walk over it carefully, but a capybara settling its heavy body on it would feel unstable and annoying. He stepped back and looked at the path. It still existed. It was still the only dry line. But it was now less inviting as a resting spot. Mateo exhaled and checked his watch. 7:18. He heard the crew truck before he saw it, tires crunching over the service road. Two men climbed out, Ramon and Felix, both wearing rubber boots and carrying a toolbox that looked older than Mateo. They greeted him with the easy familiarity of people who'd shared too many hot mornings over stubborn bolts. Ramon glanced toward the canal. "Quiet today," he observed. "Don't say that," Mateo replied instantly, and Felix laughed. Then Ramon noticed the gravel and mesh. "What's that?" he asked. "Capybaras," Mateo said. Felix's eyebrows rose. "On the path?" he asked. Mateo nodded. "They were holding the pinch point," he said. "Canoes were drifting slow because everyone was hesitating." Ramon made a thoughtful sound. "So you fixed the capybara like you fix a leak," he said, amused. Mateo shrugged. "They were here for the grass," he replied. "Now the grass is gone." Ramon nodded slowly. "Smart," he said. They moved onto the platform and began the gate lift procedure. Check the locking pin, grease the wheel, turn carefully. The metal groaned in protest like it always did. The gate rose a few centimeters, and the water responded immediately. The current under the gate sharpened. The canal surface began to show a subtle draw, a line that pointed downstream like an arrow. Mateo watched the water, listening for debris. None. The flow was clean. Downstream, the first canoe appeared. Two men again, but different ones than yesterday, paddling with the confidence of people who knew release day meant faster travel. Behind them came another canoe, then another, a small parade forming as the news of the lift spread through the marsh like a rumor. Mateo's chest tightened. Here we go. As the first canoe approached the floodgate, the men lined up and let the current carry them through. Their paddles barely touched the water. They glided cleanly past the concrete wall, right along the service path. No hesitation. Then, from the opposite bank reeds, something moved. A rounded head, wet and calm, surfaced like a floating log that suddenly blinked. Capybara. Mateo felt his shoulders tense. The animal watched the canoes pass with mild interest, then paddled slowly toward the gate corner, not in panic, not fleeing, just drifting with its own intention. A second head appeared behind it. Two capybaras. Ramon muttered, "They're back." Mateo didn't answer. He watched carefully. The capybaras swam across the canal and approached the service path. If they climbed out onto the narrow strip again, the whole drift-slow problem would return within minutes, especially now, with more canoe traffic and more nervous paddlers. The first capybara reached the bank and put its front paws on the gravelly edge. It paused. Mateo held his breath. The animal sniffed the air, nose twitching, then looked down at the gravel layer where yesterday there had been tender grass. It pawed once, as if testing texture, then shifted its weight toward the mesh edge. The mesh flexed slightly under the capybara's weight. Not dangerous, just unpleasant in a body language way. Unstable, not a good place to settle. The capybara froze again, ears flicking. Then it made a decision that made Mateo's entire chest loosen. It turned. Not running, just turning away from the path. It waddled along the bank and climbed onto a wider patch of mud farther downstream where reeds formed a natural shade pocket. There it shook once, water spraying in a halo, then settled into the mud like it was perfectly satisfied. The second capybara followed, choosing the same wider bank. The service path remained clear. Mateo exhaled slowly, the kind of exhale that felt like unclenching a fist you hadn't realized you were holding. Felix nudged Ramon with his elbow. "Your leak fix worked," he whispered. Mateo didn't celebrate yet. He'd learned not to celebrate too early around wildlife. Animals tested new boundaries repeatedly, and released day traffic would keep coming. Sure enough, within an hour, the canal was busy. Canoes moved through in a steady stream. Farmers, fishers, kids being ferried across to school by an older cousin. The water ran faster, and most paddlers were happy to let it carry them through the pinch point. But then a problem arrived in the form of human behavior, as it always did. A tour canoe, painted bright blue with a logo, came from upstream carrying 3 visitors and a local paddler in the stern. They approached slowly, cameras out, talking loudly. One visitor pointed at the capybaras lounging downstream. "Look, giant guinea pigs," she squealed. The local guide, trying to impress, angled the canoe closer to the downstream bank where the capybaras were resting, not because it was safe or useful, but because tourists wanted the shot. Mateo felt a flicker of irritation. People could undo calm faster than animals. The canoe drifted close enough that the capybaras lifted their heads sharply. Their calm changed to alertness, ears up, bodies tense. One capybara slid toward the water. "Hey," Mateo called, voice carrying from the platform. "Keep distance." The guide looked up, surprised, then waved like it was friendly. He didn't move away fast. The capybara slipped into the canal, water splashing. The second followed. Now, instead of lounging on the wide downstream bank, they were in the water again, right where the current pulled toward the gate corner. Mateo's stomach tightened, not because capybaras were dangerous, but because movement created unpredictable crossings. A canoe trying to avoid splashing too close to an animal would alter its line. Altered lines at a pinch point caused scrapes, bumps, panic. The blue canoe backed off slightly, but the damage was done. The capybaras were swimming upstream again, heading for the floodgate. Ramon swore under his breath. Mateo leaned over the rail and watched their trajectory. The animals weren't aiming for the path this time. They were moving toward the calmer eddy just inside the gate corner, where current was slower and the water felt safe. They reached the corner and hovered there, bobbing gently. One placed paws on the bank again. Mateo made a quick choice. "Felix," he said, "grab that spare mesh." Felix moved immediately, trusting Mateo's tone. Mateo didn't want to shout or throw things. He wanted to create a gentle physical cue that said, "This bank is not an exit point today." He climbed down, walked carefully along the platform steps, and approached the corner from the inland side where he could stay on concrete, not in mud. Felix followed with the mesh. Mateo held up one hand to the approaching canoes, "Slow down," and another hand to Felix, "Wait." When the capybara tried to climb, Mateo and Felix extended the mesh like a temporary screen, not touching the animal, just presenting a flexible barrier a meter from the bank. The capybara hesitated, nose twitching, then backed into the water. It tried again at a slightly different point, and the mesh shifted with it, always a soft "no" without contact. The capybara huffed quietly, an exhale that sounded like annoyance more than fear. Then it swam away to the wide downstream bank again, where reeds were thicker and where no canoe had business approaching. The second capybara followed, and within minutes both were out of the pinch zone. Mateo let his shoulders drop. He looked at Felix. "We keep this up until the tour canoe leaves," he murmured. Felix nodded. "Humans," he said, meaning it like a curse. Mateo climbed back up to the platform and raised his radio to the harbor patrol frequency used for canal enforcement. The marsh didn't have full-time patrol, but release day sometimes got a volunteer ranger on a motorboat. "This is Gate Station," Mateo said into the radio. "We've got tourist canoe traffic crowding capybaras downstream. Animals are moving into the pinch zone. Need a quick pass to remind small craft to keep distance from wildlife." Static, then a calm reply. "Copy. On the way." Mateo turned back toward the canal. The blue canoe was still lingering. Tourists pointing, guides smiling like he discovered something. Mateo's patience thinned. He didn't like being the bad guy, but he liked accidents less. He cupped his hands and called firmly, "Move on! No wildlife approaches near the gate!" This time the guide got the message. He paddled away, still talking, still laughing, but leaving. As the canoe drifted off, the capybaras stayed on their downstream bank, chewing and blinking as if they had never been bothered. The canoes began moving smoothly again. The pinch zone returned to its clean glide. Ramon leaned over and gave Mateo a look that was half respect, half exhaustion. "You just managed capybaras and tourists with plastic mesh," he said. Mateo shrugged. "Same principle," he replied. "Make the wrong choice inconvenient." Ramon laughed quietly, then went back to the gate wheel. By noon, the release was stable, the canal refreshed, and the traffic eased. The patrol boat arrived late, but made a slow pass anyway, telling a few curious paddlers to keep distance from wildlife. The capybaras remained on the wide bank, exactly where Mateo wanted them. When the crew finally lowered the gate again, the current softened, and the marsh went back to its normal slow breathing. Mateo packed up his sealant tube and mesh lengths, hands sticky and tired. He walked once more along the service path. It was still dry, still usable, still the narrow line everyone relied on. And it was still attractive because it was dry. Mateo knew the capybaras would test it again on another morning, especially after rain. He also knew he couldn't stand guard forever, so before he left, he did the most important thing, the boring thing that actually lasted. He wrote a note in the maintenance log. Capybaras using service path as resting spot due to seep grass plus shade. Gravel plus sealant reduced attraction. Recommend permanent gravel strip plus low rail to prevent lounging at pinch point. Post wildlife distance sign for canoe traffic on release days. He closed the logbook and set it back in its clip. As he started his truck, he looked out at the downstream bank where the capybaras lounged in reeds, calm as ever. They hadn't been the enemy. They had simply chosen the best path for them. The canoes had drifted slow because humans were trying to share a narrow route without a clear rule for who yielded. Mateo had added a rule, not with force, but with design. And for now, in the marsh, that was enough.